the best of it. Since I sit between you and happy hour or whatever else you have to do this evening. We're going to talk about a transition process from risk assessment to risk management. We're going to talk about this in two different perspectives. One being the transition of the focus or the shift of focus within the regulatory world from pushing on risk assessments to pushing risk management. And we're also going to talk about, for your organizations, how do you successfully make that transition from risk assessment to risk management? My perspective comes from the trenches. I do this kind of work with clients all the time, so I'm kind of telling you stories from in the trenches as opposed to just content. I started in IT in 1996, which feels like a really long time ago. I can't even remember that at this point. Been in information security and compliance since about 2005. My roles at SDG Blue are in healthcare consulting services, particularly HIPAA risk assessments, HIPAA risk management, transitioning clients out of risk analysis into risk management, and then I lead our VCISO practice where clients look to us to manage these kind of processes for them. There's a couple certifications if you care at all about those. So risk assessment. We all know what a risk assessment is. It's a core component of any information security program. It's how I establish what are the risks in my organization so that I know what I want to do about those. And as you're also aware, it's a very core component of any regulatory compliance efforts. Most regulations say you must conduct a risk assessment. HIPAA says you must conduct an accurate and thorough assessment of risks. What does accurate and thorough means? You can come up with your own definition for that. That's HIPAA for you. But organizations spend millions of dollars to meet those compliance requirements to determine where risks are and trying to avoid a breach. When I was doing risk assessments for clients in 2013 kind of time frame, 2012, 2013, I was doing that risk assessment for them and it was their first one. Now I see many clients who have been doing those risk assessments over time. In 2016, many of those are on those annual updates to that risk assessment, only really adding changes to IT infrastructure, changes to what goes in the cloud versus on-premise, maybe a change in staff or outsourcing services, those kind of things. And that's a good progression, but too many of those same organizations have a shelf where 3 years worth of risk assessment reports sit. So what does that mean? They're not doing anything with the information they're given. So they do the risk assessment, they understand now what all the risks are. Okay, I fulfilled that compliance requirement, let me put that up there on the shelf and I'll eventually get back to that. What's the problem? They never really get back to it. So we're shifting the focus from assess to manage of risk. Regulations, like in this year and beyond, are moving from an assessment focus to a management focus. What does that mean? We're going to talk about specifics, some of the language of each of the regulatory bodies, or a few of those, but they're shifting over to that, okay, you've done your risk assessment, I want to see what you're doing with those risks that you've identified in the area of risk management. And I think they're making an assumption that all organizations have done a risk assessment. That's probably a bad assumption. I have many clients that I work with now, or that we at SDG Blue work with, who are doing their first risk assessment, or they're doing their first risk assessment that's beyond the checklist, where they literally go down a list and check some boxes. And then many of those, again, have the risk assessment where they've still got the risks they had 3 years ago. Shift in focus from OCR for healthcare organizations. OCR is the enforcing body behind Health and Human Services. In 2012, 2013, when they went through that phase of audits, they said, show me a copy of your most recent risk assessment. That's where they started, and in many cases, that's where they ended. If you did not have that risk assessment, they're going to slap you on the hand. If you had a few other weaknesses, they may fine you a bit, but they never really got into risk management. Even though in some of the meaningful use language, in some of the OCR language, or the HIPAA language, it says there's a requirement to do risk management. They didn't really focus there. Their focus was in, show us that risk assessment and let's see what risks you've identified. Now, in this second phase of audits, they've even gone so far as to change the audit protocol that they use to audit organizations. This is the language here at the bottom, but essentially, we want to see the results of your risk assessment. We want to see what steps you're taking to remediate those risks. So that focus is a big shift from what they were doing the last time. For those of you in the healthcare world, you probably are aware that phase 2 is ongoing at this point. They've started doing desk audits out of OCR. Here's some guidance from FFIEC for the financial world. Effective risk management processes involves these factors. These are all going to be dependent on your inherent risk profile with FFIEC and your maturity level as an organization of where you are with regard to risk assessment or risk management. But again, the focus here is on managing of risks, not just assessing. One more framework you can use here is ISO 27001. They've got this risk treatment implementation that you have to apply security controls. You have to transfer the risk or avoid the risk, accept the risk. Those are things we're going to talk about in a moment. But they're talking about getting creative and finding a way to do something with those risks that have been identified, as opposed to just putting them on paper. So what's your plan? So your organization now has a risk register. You understand, here's my big list of risks. What do I do with those? And what are some of the key elements to make me successful in transitioning out of having a list of risks to beginning to work that list down until I'm minimizing risks or even eliminating some risks, depending on what the risk may be. So, anybody in this room feel like they have a rock solid plan? Yeah, I could say that for most of the ones that I work with. So what next steps should we be looking toward? Risk assessed and documented, now what? So where do we go from here? How do we tackle this? Who owns what steps in risk management? The organization owns risk management, not one person in an IT department, one person in a compliance department, not one person on a risk management committee. It's an organizational thing. We're going to talk about that. It goes all the way from executive management down to those folks who are implementing the controls to minimize those risks. How are risks prioritized? This is a big one. So risks may attach themselves to a human resources group. They may attach themselves to an accounting department. They may attach themselves to IT. Everyone's going to be coming back looking for money and people to remediate those risks. So how do we prioritize and decide which one happens first, which one gets the money, and which one's left to be accepted or left on the list? And then when is the process complete? Risk management's never really complete. You make strides, you remediate certain risks, and then about the time you get those finished, you get new risks to pop up as things change within the organization and technology. So step one, develop a treatment and response strategy for all risks based on governance from management. We call this risk tolerance. How much risk is my organization willing to tolerate? And that can largely be dependent on what the risk is, but that's going to be defined at a top level of the organization. You don't want people in the tactical side of risk management making these type of decisions. This can come from a risk management committee if that committee is influenced by the organization, as long as they're not operating in a silo where they're not taking input from risk management or from, executive management. So, for example, a group may say, we want to accept all low risks and we're going to remediate everything or manage everything that's medium and high. So this is where executive management gets involved in the process and they help you establish what your baseline is. I'm going to remove all those lows from my list, and now I know I have highs and mediums to address. So how am I going to address those? This is where the transition starts. Risk tolerance, as we talked about, is driven by one or more of these three factors. Very much driven by regulatory compliance. I heard a guy this morning talking about regulatory compliance is kind of down at the low end of a maturity scale. We're going to talk a little about maturity here in a moment. And I agree with that to a degree, but often when I'm trying to manage risk, regulatory compliance is my driving force to get me dollars to help manage those risks. So that's where a lot of risk tolerance comes from, based on where I need to be in line with the regulations. I'm going to be able to tolerate more or less risk. Security risks associated to information technology assets. How much toleration do I have for risk in my core system versus some ancillary system that's owned over in some department that IT doesn't have any influence on? Certainly going to be a different level of risk that I'm probably willing to accept. And then industry and competitive pressures. That certainly can, if I'm trying to deliver some new service or improve upon some service or do something new, something more cutting edge, I may take on more risk with that particular service because I'm willing to do that to be competitive in the marketplace. And then most of the organizations, it's some combination of these factors that leads to defining your risk tolerance. Step 2, define and document the strategy for handling risks in one of the following categories: accept, remediate, transfer, and avoid. And we're going to focus on one thing here. Not all risks are remediated. Does anyone agree with that statement? A few people? Maybe? Okay. Some risks cannot be remediated. It's just the way the world works. So now that you're transitioning, risk management starts with a clear plan developed based on governance input from management, as we talked about before. This is where the risk tolerance plays in. So if I have made that assumption that we made on a couple slides ago that says all risks below medium are going to be accepted, I'm going to put that in the accept bucket. And now I have to use these other strategies for the rest of those risks. So we're going to step through a few examples, and I'm going to ask for participation. This group doesn't seem to participate a lot, so I'm going to ask you to participate. So here's the scenario. I've got a legacy application not managed by IT, has many active users who are no longer employed. All data in the application is duplicated in other current production application systems. Anyone want to say what you would do with this risk with one of those 4 treatment strategies?
Avoid, turn it off.
Good answer. Participation, I hope. Makes my job easier. Got another scenario. A critical software vendor has stated that their application, due to restrictions on performance and stability, cannot apply Windows updates, nor can anti-malware technology be run on the system. Vendor software is critical to operations and cost is exorbitant to change to the new vendor within the next 2 years. What are we going to do with this one?
Transfer.
Anyone else want to answer?
Accept.
I have to accept that risk. Because kind of the key there is we've got things that we can't control. So wrong answer, Daniel. We got things that we can't control. We can't apply basic, very elementary level security controls to this application. And we've also got a cost that we can't justify for changing vendors to try to get out of this application. So we ultimately have to accept that risk. Do this quite often, especially in the healthcare space. You've got applications that have been there for a long time. They're running on Windows 2000, and the vendor says, that system's too unstable, we can't patch it, we can't do this. And then they're trying to get it replaced, but then there's a $250,000 cost to remove that application and replace it with something else because it's also attached to a specific X-ray machine or it's attached to some other medical device. Another scenario, executive management has been reading lots of articles, information about breaches and feeling panic. Anyone heard that story before? During a recent management meeting, the CFO recommends purchasing cyber insurance just in case. Transfer, that one's easy. That's really the best example of transference of risk. There are a few other, if you get specific and get down into the details, if you think about a scenario where it existed more in the tape world than backup. So if I have a lot of backup tapes and I own those and it's IT's responsibility to get those out of the building and off-site every day, and they don't do what they're supposed to and they end up staying in the back seat of the car or whatever, I can transfer that risk to some courier service to take those tapes, get them over to a vault, secure them in the vault. I can transfer by taking data that we're supposed to dispose of on hard drives, on tapes, on whatever, and have Shredded or Iron Mountain, one of those folks come in, destroy that data for us, give us a log certificate of destruction. That's also transference of risk. While the organization stated that all laptop devices were protected with full disk encryption, it has been determined that a significant number of devices no longer have full disk encryption installed. Workstations have local admin rights to users, and full disk encryption has been disabled. It got disabled because they had local admin rights. Anyone want to guess on this one? It's tough. I know this one's tough. And I'm going to tell you that it's actually a little bit of all kinds of things. So we got remediate, and probably a bit of educate. So remediating, one thing is, who thinks it's a good idea to have local admin rights on workstations? Many of our clients, unfortunately. And then full disk encryption has been disabled, so I've got to get that redeployed back to those workstations. So remediate, two different pieces of remediation, and then also, again, probably a bit of educate to help those end users understand that software was put there for a reason, so let's don't kill it. Step 3. So now we have decided all the risk that we've got left after we've either blanketly accepted a bunch of risk because they were low, or whatever our strategy has been. We're now at the point where we've got to put that into a plan and communicate that up to management so that later on, when we're ready to execute on that plan, they are aware of what we're doing in risk management, and we're going to be more apt to get our people and our dollars that we need to go remediate these risks. You can see here the statement that I make at this point in the process is where many organizations break down. If you don't do that up front, management hasn't been aware all along, and all of a sudden, out of the blue, I come to them and say, we've got to go do all this stuff. We've got to do full disk encryption, and we've got to get cyber insurance, and we've got to do all these things. And we just pile on. So where's this coming from? Well, it's coming from the fact that we've got all these risks, and we have to get rid of them, or we're going to be non-compliant, we're going to be at risk of breaches, et cetera, et cetera. So prioritize your initiatives, which are required to manage risk, and associate those initiatives to resources needed. Again, people and funds. I'm going to talk a little bit about some practices that I utilize with clients, and it's been pretty successful. In conjunction with management, determine a list of initiatives related to information security compliance. Prioritize those and work with the client. In my case, your side internally, work with your internal stakeholders to say, what are the most important risks on this list for us to remediate? Now, those may be ones that were identified from a risk assessment. It may get things added to it. We're going to acquire this other organization. We don't know what risks we're bringing as we acquire that other organization, so we're going to put that on the list of priorities. So I go through that pass and prioritize with them the first time. Many of those folks will look at me and say, just put some priority on them. And I'll do that and go back to them and say, okay, let's work together. We have to work together here to get this list right. We prioritize it the first time with no cost. I always do this without a cost the first time. The second time, go back and do it with cost attached, because things certainly can change when I add those costs. Did the priorities change when I add costs? Very likely. Because if something needs $250,000 and 500 man hours over the next 3 months to remediate, it may move in the priority list, depending on the organization, of course. Suggestive practice number 2, from your list of initiatives, develop a roadmap. This roadmap should take into account an established baseline and a goal for managing risks. The road should lead you to the end destination. That sounds very wordy. The destination can be vastly different from one organization to another. How far is one organization going to go in risk management with regard to maturity and another? That is certainly vastly different in our client base. Very different in your organizations. You may have some organizations investing, millions of dollars in information security and compliance. You have others who may spend a fraction of their IT budget on information security and compliance. The approaches there are different. The process shouldn't be any different, but the mindset and the approach behind it is going to be different. My roadmap as a small 50-user organization is going to look different than an enterprise corporate environment. It just has to, because the funds and the people just aren't there. This is a sneak peek. This is the first time I think this has been publicly presented, and it's just literally a sneak peek at this point. We kind of bounced around whether we were going to do this, but I decided to do it anyway. So SDG Blue is actually developing a maturity model which allows you to establish that baseline, set up a target profile, and then build that roadmap over time. It's being built to work with organizations where you're a teeny tiny 50-user organization or you're an enterprise class organization. You can see here some of the various domains. I think a couple of these have been renamed in the most recent past. We are working on this very diligently at this point, hoping to try to get it to some draft state by the end of the year. So a few of these domain names have changed, but you can see across the top. You go anywhere from 0 to 5, from non-existent all the way up through optimizing. So the stars may indicate a particular case study where someone wants to be defined and proactive in asset management, but they are, they're sitting right on 3 at that point, so they're within their maturity level. So this is their target, the blue, and the star indicates where they are as we establish that baseline. Their roadmap may say, within the area of risk management, I want to be a 4, so I want to be measured and verified. I want to be able to say, I know that risk management is successful because of these particular metrics that I'm able to measure on. So that's, again, a sneak peek to something we're working on. We believe it's going to allow for more effective risk management because I'm measuring against something solid as opposed to perception of measuring against regulatory compliance and what we all call best practices. Step 4, define risk owners and set clear completion dates for remediation activity. This is the executable part of the plan. I have to know if a remediation, if an avoidance of risk, an acceptance of risk, or a transfer of risks needs to happen to manage that particular risk. I need to know who owns that. Because I have to hold someone responsible, otherwise I can't manage that. That's the case with any kind of management, but in this case, managing risk, we have to know who's responsible, make sure that person meets the deadlines for getting that done. Tools for doing risk management, particularly when we get into the executable phase. Those larger enterprise organizations are probably going to have some type of GRC solution in-house, and they're going to manage against maybe 1, 2, 3, 5 different frameworks, and they're going to have the ability to do that. Stepping up the scale a bit, you see a product there called HIPAA 1. It's something we utilize. It's very niche-based. It's for healthcare organizations to assess and manage risk. We use that tool with our clients. That's very niche-centric. And then the rest of the world, which is probably a big percentage, is doing the best they can with spreadsheets and Word documents, unfortunately. Now, that's very time-consuming for those of us that live in the risk management world, but if that's all you have, it's better than haphazardly just going about your business or just leaving that risk assessment report sitting on the shelf because I don't have the best in GRC tools or anything automated to help me with that process. Define performance indicators to measure success of implemented controls. You saw in step 4 of the maturity model where it said that we can measure and it's defined as to what success is. It says here there's no end to the process of risk management. The process is ongoing and continuous. We all know that. Things change, the applications change, the environment changes from infrastructure, staff changes, acquisitions happen, so risks are going to change. So we have to evolve. But how do we know that the controls we're putting in place are effective without some type of metrics to measure them? So in this case, we have to define what those performance indicators are to say, my remediation controls are being effective, my processors are being effective in minimizing risk. How do I know that? Because as I circle back around the next year, I'm able to evaluate those metrics over time. I'm going to reassess my risk again, and I'm going to see that I have removed risks from the list from the year prior. Continuously report status to management via risk management committee or other platform. How many of your organizations have some type of a risk management team or a risk management committee? Are you all in larger organizations? Yep. What about the smaller folks? This is probably going to be 25% of someone's job. It may be a compliance officer, it may be an information security officer, it may be a CIO, it may be an IT director, it may be someone else. But it may be 25% of someone else's job to have to manage this on a regular basis. So again, continuously keeping management involved. We said before, implement them in the process very early on, and continuously keep them updated so that when you are asking for funding to remediate, you're much more likely to have success there. Some resources that some of this data comes from, and just some from past experience. Myself, if you're in the healthcare space, You're probably familiar with NIST 800-30. That's, it was mentioned this morning as well, the risk management framework from NIST. Certainly a good place to start, whether you're in the healthcare space or not. But most of the regulatory governance organizations point to NIST as the framework to follow, even though they don't explicitly say you must use NIST. It would be easier. ISACA, you all are familiar with that organization. They have a lot of good risk management framework documentation through COVID. It's very good stuff. I would recommend taking a look at those if you have not. And then the direct links to the NIST 837, there's also 800-30 out there. 37 focuses more on risk management, whereas 30 is more on risk assessment. But as we do that transition process, being aware of both of those is certainly important. I said I would help you get out of here earlier today, and I met that goal. Any questions? Anybody face this challenge of your organization understands what the risks are, but just not being able to execute on that remediation or risk management process? I see people smiling and raising eyebrows, but any stories, horror stories from the world? All right. Well, thank you all very much. Appreciate your time. Hopefully you learned something useful. If you have any questions, feel free to, I'll hang around for a few minutes after, so if you have any questions, feel free to ask. Otherwise, thank you very much for your time and enjoy the rest of the show.